The morning sun cast golden rays through the old wooden blinds, illuminating the dust particles that danced in the air. Samuel Carter slowly opened his eyes to the familiar sound of birds chirping outside his window, their melodies a routine part of his mornings. He stretched his aching limbs, the stiffness of age reminding him that time was relentless. Despite his years, his mind was as sharp as ever, and his connection to the land he had called home for over 60 years remained unshaken. This place was more than just a house, it was his sanctuary, the last remnant of a life filled with triumphs, losses, and quiet moments of solitude. As he shuffled into the kitchen and poured himself a steaming cup of coffee, something outside the window caught his attention. A small white paper fluttered on his front door, secured by a single strip of tape. His brows furrowed. It wasn't a newspaper or an advertisement. Something about it felt different. Samuel sighed, setting his coffee down before stepping onto the porch. The crisp morning air brushed against his face as he peeled the paper from the door, a deep sense of unease settling in his chest. His eyes scanned the bold, capitalized letters at the top, and his heartbeat quickened. Final notice: Delinquent Homeowner Association dues. A chill ran down his spine. He skimmed through the rest of the document, his breath hitching at the demand. Dear property owner, our records indicate that you have an outstanding balance of $122,000 in unpaid homeowners association dues. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in legal action, which may include foreclosure of your property. Samuel clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around the paper. Homeowners association? He had never signed up for any homeowners association. This land had been in his family since his father bought it after returning from World War II. Samuel had built this house with his own two hands after leaving the military, brick by brick. How could he possibly owe money to an organization he had never agreed to be a part of? His eyes dropped to the signature at the bottom. Nathan Holloway, president of the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association. Below was an address for the HOA office and a phone number for urgent payment arrangements. Samuel exhaled sharply. This had to be some kind of mistake. He wasn't part of any homeowners association. He had lived here for decades without interference, and he wasn't about to start answering to some bureaucratic paper pushers who thought they could waltz in and take what wasn't theirs. His gut told him this wasn't just a clerical error. He had heard the horror stories. HOAs abusing their power, bullying homeowners into compliance, even seizing properties under the guise of unpaid dues. But this wasn't some cookie-cutter subdivision. This was his private land, and yet, here he was being treated like a trespasser on his own property. Samuel wasted no time. He stepped back inside, placed the letter on the table, and grabbed his old reading glasses. Sitting down, he took a deep breath and examined every line carefully. Nowhere in the notice was there mention of a contract or agreement he had signed. It was just a demand for payment, backed by an aggressive threat. He scoffed. If they thought he would just roll over and pay, they had another thing coming. He needed answers. Picking up the phone, he dialed the number listed at the bottom of the letter. It rang a few times before an automated voice greeted him. Thank you for calling Ridgecrest Homeowners Association. If you're calling about a past due balance, press 1. If you would like to speak to a representative, press 2. Samuel pressed 2. A few seconds later, a woman's voice came through the line. Ridgecrest Homeowners Association, this is Laura speaking. How may I assist you today? Samuel's voice was steady but firm. This is Samuel Carter. I just received a notice claiming I owe money to your homeowners association, but I've never been part of one. I need someone to explain why I'm being charged for something I never agreed to. There was a brief pause before Laura responded, her tone carrying the distinct air of someone reading from a script. Mr. Carter, our records show that your property is now part of the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association due to recent community zoning adjustments. As part of this transition, all homeowners are required to comply with HOA regulations, including the payment of dues. Samuel narrowed his eyes. Zoning adjustments? My land isn't part of any community development. It's private property. I understand your concerns, sir, but all properties within the newly designated Ridgecrest residential zone are subject to HOA governance. If you would like to dispute this, you will need to submit a formal appeal in writing. However, Please note that homeowners association dues are mandatory and non-negotiable. Samuel clenched his fist. You can't just throw me into a homeowners association without my consent and demand I pay thousands of dollars. The woman's voice remained composed, but carried a hint of irritation. Sir, the HOA board has already issued multiple notices regarding this transition. If you have further disputes, you will need to speak directly with our president, Mr. Holloway. I can schedule an appointment for you if you'd like. Samuel exhaled through his nose. Fine. Set it up. Tomorrow at 10. Our office is located at 25 Ridgecrest Drive. Samuel hung up without another word. He sat in silence for a moment, staring at the notice on the table. A storm was brewing, and he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move to steal his land. But they had made a grave mistake. They had underestimated him. He may have been 90 years old, but Samuel Carter wasn't going anywhere without a fight. Samuel Carter arrived at the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association office precisely at 10 a.m. the next morning. The building was a sleek, modern structure with floor-to-ceiling glass windows that stood in stark contrast to the historic charm of the town. It reeked of bureaucracy, a place built on paperwork and power plays, the kind of place where decisions were made behind closed doors with little regard for the people they affected. Samuel had dealt with men like these before, self-important, power-hungry bureaucrats who saw homeowners as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. He had no patience for them. The reception area was cold and unwelcoming, decorated with minimalist furniture and a massive framed document on the wall that read Ridgecrest Homeowners Association Community Standards and Regulations. A woman sat behind the front desk, her face neutral as she typed away on a keyboard, barely acknowledging his presence. Name? She asked without looking up. Samuel Carter, he replied, his voice steady. Her fingers hesitated for a second before she finally met his gaze, her expression shifting slightly. Ah, you have a meeting with Mr. Holloway. Please take a seat. Samuel didn't bother. He remained standing, his hands in his pockets, surveying the room as if he owned it. A few minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, and a tall man in an expensive navy suit emerged from a nearby office. His hair was slicked back, his movements deliberate, and his expression carried the forced politeness of someone who was used to getting his way. Mr. Carter, the man said with a practiced smile, extending a hand. Nathan Holloway, I appreciate you taking the time to come in. Samuel didn't take the offered handshake. Didn't have much of a choice, now did I? His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Holloway withdrew his hand smoothly, unfazed. Let's discuss this in my office. Samuel followed him into a large, meticulously organized office with a wall of windows that overlooked the manicured lawns of the new Ridgecrest housing development. The houses in the distance were all identical, neatly lined up like rows of soldiers, each one bearing the same sterile uniformity. It made Samuel sick. Holloway gestured to a chair, but Samuel remained standing. I'm not here to make myself comfortable, he said. I'm here because you people think you can steal my land. Holloway sighed, as if he were dealing with an unreasonable child. Mr. Carter, let's not be dramatic. No one is stealing anything. The Ridgecrest community has undergone some restructuring, and your property now falls under HOA jurisdiction. It's standard practice. Samuel scoffed. Standard practice? I've lived on that land for 60 years. Built my home with my own hands. There was no homeowners association then, and I sure as hell never signed anything saying I wanted to be part of one. Holloway leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. I understand your frustration, but legally, when a community is rezoned, existing properties are incorporated into the new HOA guidelines. It's all within the county's authority. Samuel narrowed his eyes. And let me guess, you had nothing to do with that rezoning, did you? Holloway's smile didn't waver. The board simply proposed what we thought was best for the future of Ridgecrest. Samuel shook his head. You mean the future where you get to line your pockets while people like me are forced out of our homes? Holloway sighed dramatically. Mr. Carter, no one is forcing you out. You're simply being asked to contribute to the maintenance of the community like all other residents. Samuel's jaw tightened. Except I was never part of your community. I don't use your roads, your facilities, or your services. and I sure as hell didn't vote for any of this. Holloway tapped his fingers on the desk. Regardless of how you feel about it, the dues must be paid. If they're not, legal action will be taken. Samuel crossed his arms. And if I don't pay? Holloway leaned back in his chair, his voice smooth. Then the HOA will place a lien on your property. There was the real threat. Samuel took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. A lien for dues I never agreed to pay. That's how you operate? Holloway's expression remained composed. That's how the system works, Mr. Carter. Once the lien is in place, if the debt remains unpaid, foreclosure proceedings will begin. Samuel let the words settle in the air between them. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. They weren't trying to collect dues. They were trying to take his home. Holloway studied him for a moment, then offered a thin smile. I think you'll find that fighting us will be far more costly than simply paying what you owe. Samuel didn't flinch. He had faced worse men than Nathan Holloway in his lifetime. We'll see about that. With that, he turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding, but his resolve solid. As soon as he stepped outside, he took a deep breath. The sun was still shining, but for the first time, his land, his home, felt like it was under siege. He had no intention of backing down. This fight was only just beginning. Samuel Carter didn't drive straight home after leaving the Homeowners Association office. He needed answers. His gut told him this wasn't just some bureaucratic overreach. This was a calculated move, a land grab disguised as policy. And if that was true, he needed to figure out exactly how deep this corruption went before it was too late. He steered his truck toward the county records office, a small beige building that had stood in the town for decades, outlasting the various city officials who passed through its doors. Samuel had been here before, years ago, when he fought to get his property taxes adjusted after an assessor tried to claim his land was part of a commercial district. That battle had taken months, but Samuel had won. He wasn't afraid of a long fight. The air inside smelled of dust and old paper, and behind the desk sat a young clerk, barely looking up from her computer as he approached. Without hesitation, Samuel placed the HOA notice on the counter and spoke with quiet authority. He needed to look up zoning records, specifically anything related to Ridgecrest. The clerk glanced at him skeptically before typing into her system. After a few moments, her frown deepened. Something was off. Samuel leaned in, watching her expression shift as she scanned the files. According to the initial zoning proposal, his property wasn't even included in the HOA's jurisdiction. His land had been separate from the community, untouched by any zoning changes. But then the clerk scrolled further, and there it was. An amendment had been added at the last minute, 3 months ago, long after the original rezoning had been proposed. Someone had gone in and deliberately altered the records to include his land. Samuel clenched his fists. He had been right. This wasn't just some blanket policy change. Someone had made a conscious decision to pull him into this mess. And there was only one name that made sense. When Samuel asked who had filed the amendment, the clerk hesitated before clicking through a few more pages. Then she exhaled sharply and turned the screen slightly toward him. The name at the bottom of the document was exactly who he expected: Nathan Holloway. Of course it was. The smug bureaucrat hadn't just taken advantage of the rezoning. He had ensured that Samuel's property was included, and now he was using that to leverage him into compliance. The clerk's voice was careful as she spoke, warning him that amendments like this were rarely made so late in the process. Someone had pulled strings to make it happen. Samuel gave her a knowing look and requested copies of every relevant document. As the pages printed, his mind raced through the possibilities. Holloway had deliberately added his land to the HOA's control. But why? This wasn't just about HOA fees. No one went to this much trouble over some neighborhood dues. There was something bigger at play, and Samuel intended to find out exactly what it was. When the clerk handed him the documents, he tucked them into his coat and thanked her before heading back to his truck. He wasn't going home. Not yet. He had one more stop to make. Emily Graves had been his attorney for years, handling everything from minor property disputes to tax assessments. She was sharp, relentless, and had a reputation for dismantling corrupt officials in court. If anyone could help him figure out the legal angle of this mess, it was her. The moment he walked into her office, she was on the phone, gesturing for him to take a seat. He lowered himself into the chair, waiting as she wrapped up her conversation. When she finally hung up, she leaned back, smirking as if she already knew why he was there. Samuel slid the stack of papers across her desk. This wasn't just about zoning changes. It was about a direct, targeted move against him. Emily flipped through the documents, her eyes narrowing as she reached the final amendment page. Holloway had personally filed it. That changed everything. She explained that while HOAs had a lot of leeway when it came to zoning, adding a property this late in the process wasn't standard. If they could prove that Holloway had a personal or financial reason for pulling his land into the HOA, they could challenge it. Samuel exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. He needed to know what Holloway was really after. Emily tapped her desk thoughtfully before offering a single piece of advice. Start digging. Look into Holloway's financials, his connections, any backroom deals he might have made. If they could find a link between him and a larger development scheme, they could expose it. Samuel nodded, already forming a plan in his mind. He had been dragged into this fight, but he wasn't going to just sit back and let them win. As he left the office, stepping into the cool evening air, he took a deep breath. This was his home, and no HOA, no corrupt official, no greedy businessman was going to take it from him. They had started a fight. Now they had to deal with the consequences. Samuel Carter woke up before dawn. The sky outside still a deep shade of blue with the first hints of morning light creeping over the horizon. He had barely slept. His mind had been running in circles, replaying everything he had learned at the county records office and everything Emily had told him the night before. There was no doubt now. Nathan Holloway had deliberately targeted his land. The real question was why. What made Samuel's property so valuable that Holloway had risked falsifying records just to bring it under the HOA's control? He poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam curling up into the dimly lit kitchen, and stared out the window at the land he had spent decades calling home. He knew every inch of this place, every tree, every stretch of soil, every shift in the seasons. To the outside world, it might have looked like just another piece of land, but to him, it was his history, his legacy. And yet, for some reason, Holloway had gone out of his way to pull it into the HOA's jurisdiction. That meant something. Samuel didn't believe in coincidences. He needed to know exactly what Holloway was after, and he knew just the man who could help him find out. By mid-morning, Samuel was seated at a booth in a small diner on Main Street, nursing his second cup of coffee. The place had been around for decades, one of the few buildings in town that hadn't been bulldozed to make way for more modern developments like the ones Holloway and his HOA were pushing. A few minutes later, a man in his late 60s walked in, his boots heavy against the tile floor. He moved with a slight limp, a leftover souvenir from their time in the military together, and wore an old flannel shirt that had seen better days. But his eyes were as sharp as ever. Tom Reynolds slid into the booth across from Samuel, giving him a long look before shaking his head. Been a while, he muttered. Too long, Samuel agreed, waving down the waitress for a fresh cup of coffee. Appreciate you meeting me on short notice. Tom grunted, watching as the waitress poured his coffee. Figured it had to be something serious. Samuel didn't waste time. He pulled the county records documents from his coat and slid them across the table. Tom picked them up, his eyes scanning the pages with a practiced efficiency. A low whistle escaped his lips as he flipped through the documents. Damn, he muttered. He really went after you. Samuel nodded. The question is why? Tom set the papers down and leaned back in his seat, rubbing his jaw. Rezoning's a dirty game. People like Holloway don't do this kind of thing unless there's a big payout waiting at the end. Samuel narrowed his eyes. What kind of payout? Tom exhaled sharply, thinking. Could be anything: commercial development, government subsidies, mineral rights. But if they're willing to go after private land like yours, it's not just about money. It's about control. Samuel's expression darkened. Control of what? Tom sighed, his fingers tapping against the table. I'll make some calls. Samuel nodded. Appreciate it. The two sat in silence for a moment before Tom smirked. You really think you can take these bastards on by yourself? Samuel smirked right back. I'm not by myself. That evening, Samuel sat on his porch, staring out at his land as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the distant scent of rain. His phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Tom. You were right, Tom said without preamble. Samuel sat up straighter. What did you find? There's a development deal in the works. A big one. Commercial investors are looking to buy up land for some high-end project. Tom paused, letting that sink in before continuing. The catch is, they need a certain amount of acreage to qualify for state funding. And your property puts them over the threshold. Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. So this isn't just about HOA dues. Hell no, Tom said. Holloway is using the HOA as a tool to squeeze you out. Once you're gone, they sell the whole thing as a package deal. Samuel clenched his jaw. Bastards. Tom sighed. You got proof now, but that won't stop them. They'll double down. You ready for that? Samuel looked out at his land, his home, the place he had spent his entire life protecting. He had fought for it before. He'd fight for it again. Damn right I'm ready. The next morning, Samuel drove back to Emily's office, the documents from Tom in hand. She read through them, her face darkening. This changes everything. Samuel nodded. They're going to come at me harder now. I need to hit first. Emily leaned forward, her eyes flashing with determination. I have an idea. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Let's hear it. Emily smirked. We're going to make this very public. Samuel nodded slowly. How public? Emily's grin widened. I hope you don't mind some cameras on your lawn. Samuel chuckled. Let's give them a show. The fight was about to get a lot bigger. Samuel Carter stood on his porch, staring out at the land that had been his for over 60 years. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant sound of birds in the trees. But today, something felt different. There was an electricity in the air, an anticipation of the battle that was about to unfold. True to Emily's plan, things had already been set in motion. The local news station had picked up the story, and a reporter was scheduled to arrive at noon. But that wasn't all. Over the last 24 hours, word had spread like wildfire. Neighbors, townsfolk, and even strangers from outside the community had caught wind of what was happening. People were outraged. The idea of a greedy homeowners association forcing a 90-year-old veteran off his land for the sake of some corporate deal didn't sit well with anyone. Samuel could already hear the hum of approaching cars as people began gathering at the end of his long gravel driveway. Some held signs, others had cameras, and a few simply stood in quiet solidarity. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but if this was what it took to fight back, then so be it. At precisely noon, a sleek news van pulled up, and a woman in a navy blazer stepped out, adjusting her earpiece. A cameraman followed close behind, hoisting a large camera onto his shoulder. The reporter approached Samuel, extending her hand. Mr. Carter, I'm Jessica Clark with Channel 7 News. Thank you for speaking with us today. Samuel shook her hand firmly. Appreciate you coming out here. People need to know what's really going on. Jessica nodded, glancing around at the growing crowd before signaling for her cameraman to begin recording. The red light on the camera blinked to life, and Jessica turned to face it, her voice professional and steady. We're here today in Ridgecrest, where a shocking legal battle is unfolding. 90-year-old veteran Samuel Carter is being threatened with foreclosure on his property due to alleged unpaid homeowners association dues. But the twist, Mr. Carter has never been part of the homeowners association. His land was forcibly incorporated into the HOA through what appears to be a fraudulent zoning amendment. Now, the homeowners association, led by President Nathan Holloway, is pushing for legal action to remove him from his home. The question is why? She turned back to Samuel. Mr. Carter, can you tell us in your own words what's happening? Samuel took a deep breath, then spoke clearly, his voice unwavering. This land has been in my family for generations. I built my home with my own hands. I never signed up for any homeowners association, never agreed to pay their dues, and I sure as hell never gave them the right to tell me what to do on my own property. This isn't about community upkeep. This is about greed. Holloway and his homeowners association want my land so they can sell it off for profit. They think they can push me out because I'm old, but they're wrong. The crowd behind him erupted in cheers and murmurs of agreement. Jessica nodded, then turned to face the camera again. The homeowners association has yet to provide an official statement, But records obtained by Mr. Carter's legal team suggest that his property was deliberately added to the HOA's jurisdiction months after the initial rezoning process. If proven, this could constitute a fraudulent land grab. At that moment, the sound of screeching tires pulled everyone's attention toward the main road. A black luxury SUV rolled to a stop, and the driver's side door swung open. Nathan Holloway stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel, his face twisted into something between frustration and forced composure. He adjusted his suit jacket before striding toward the news crew. Jessica wasted no time. "Mr. Holloway," she called, microphone in hand. "Do you have a response to the allegations that the Homeowners Association deliberately amended zoning laws to include Mr. Carter's property without his consent?" Holloway forced a smile, though his eyes betrayed his irritation. "This is a simple misunderstanding. The Homeowners Association is merely ensuring that all properties within the community contribute their fair share to maintenance and improvements." Samuel stepped forward. "Don't feed them that nonsense, Holloway. You and I both know this is about money." Holloway's smile faltered. "Mr. Carter, if you had concerns, you should have brought them to the board instead of stirring up a media circus." Samuel crossed his arms. "I did. You told me to pay up or lose my home." Jessica pressed forward. "Mr. Holloway, if Mr. Carter's land was not originally included in the rezoning, why was an amendment filed months later to incorporate his property?" Holloway hesitated, and in that moment, Samuel knew he had him cornered. Before Holloway could recover, a new voice cut through the air. "I can answer that." The crowd parted as a man in a crisp suit approached, a folder in hand. It was Tom's contact from the county office. He held up the folder. "This contains copies of internal emails between Holloway and a county zoning official, proving that the amendment was made at his request after he had already entered negotiations with private developers." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Holloway's face turned ashen. That's privileged information." "No, it's public record now," the official countered. "And I'm here to inform you that the county has launched an official investigation into the fraudulent zoning practices of the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association." The crowd erupted in cheers. Jessica turned to the camera, barely able to contain her own astonishment. "It appears that this story has taken a dramatic turn. With a formal investigation now underway, the fate of the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association and its president remains uncertain." Holloway, realizing the walls were closing in, turned to Samuel, his voice low and furious. "You just made a powerful enemy, Carter." Samuel smirked. "I fought bigger enemies than you." Holloway stormed back to his SUV, slamming the door before speeding off. The moment he was gone, people cheered louder. Reporters swarmed, eager to get more details. But Samuel simply exhaled and turned to Emily, who had been watching the entire thing with a victorious grin. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Samuel corrected. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was swift. The county's investigation uncovered years of corruption within the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association, leading to multiple resignations and lawsuits. Holloway was removed from his position and later arrested for fraud. Without its corrupt leadership, the HOA collapsed entirely, and Samuel stayed right where he belonged, on his land, in his home, where no one could ever take it from him again. As he sat on his porch, watching the sunset over his fields, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Samuel Carter sat in his living room, stacks of legal documents spread out on the table in front of him. The investigation into the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association had gained momentum, and with the county officials now involved, Holloway's fraudulent zoning scheme was unraveling faster than he could contain it. But Samuel knew that men like Holloway never went down without a fight. There was still a chance that he would try to stall the process, find loopholes, or use his influence to delay the inevitable. Samuel had spent his life dealing with men who thought they could manipulate the system to their advantage, and he wasn't about to let Holloway slip through the cracks. He had come too far to stop now. Just as he was reviewing the latest legal notices from Emily, a knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Tom stood on the porch, holding a thick manila envelope. Without a word, he stepped inside and handed it over. Samuel opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. Inside were more documents, but this time, They weren't just legal records. They were financial statements, property transfers, and internal memos from Ridgecrest board members. His eyes narrowed as he flipped through them. These weren't just any files. They were proof that Holloway had been personally profiting from the HOA's aggressive foreclosures. Several properties had been seized under similar claims of unpaid dues, only to be quickly sold to private developers for a fraction of their market value. The connections were clear. Holloway wasn't just enforcing HOA policies. He was running a full-scale real estate scam under the guise of community regulations. Samuel exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of what he was holding. This was it. This was the evidence they needed to not just expose Holloway, but to ensure he faced real consequences. Tom leaned against the wall, watching Samuel's reaction. You see it now, don't you? This was never about maintenance fees or zoning laws. It was about money, power, and control. Samuel clenched his jaw, and he was willing to ruin lives to get it. Tom nodded, and he would have gotten away with it too, if you hadn't fought back. Samuel knew what had to be done. He grabbed his phone and dialed Emily. The moment she picked up, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. We have him. He's been flipping foreclosed properties for profit. Emily's voice sharpened with interest. Are you sure? Samuel looked down at the documents again. Positive. Holloway isn't just enforcing HOA rules. He's orchestrating a fraud scheme. There was a pause on the other end before Emily responded, her tone decisive. Then we need to take this straight to the county prosecutor. Samuel nodded. That's exactly what I was thinking. Later that afternoon, Samuel and Emily met with the lead investigator from the county's legal office, presenting every document, email, and financial record they had gathered. The investigator listened carefully, flipping through the pages with a growing look of concern. When he reached the final set of documents, he let out a slow breath. This is enough to bring criminal charges. Holloway won't just lose his position. He'll be facing serious jail time. Samuel felt a grim satisfaction settle in his chest. Good. Because men like him don't stop unless they're forced to. Emily smirked. And we're about to make sure that happens. As they left the prosecutor's office, Samuel took a deep breath. The weight of the past few weeks had been immense, but for the first time, he felt like they were finally on the verge of victory. Ridgecrest had spent years abusing its authority, preying on homeowners who didn't have the resources to fight back. But this time, they had gone after the wrong man. And now, justice was coming. Samuel Carter sat on his porch as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over his land. The weight of the past few weeks pressed on him, but for the first time, there was a sense of momentum. The prosecutor had the documents, the investigation was moving forward, and Holloway was running out of places to hide. But Samuel knew better than to celebrate too early. Men like Holloway didn't go down without a fight, and if he had learned anything over the years, it was that when powerful men got desperate, they got dangerous. Just as he was about to head inside, his phone buzzed. It was Emily. You need to get to my office now. There was an urgency in her voice that made Samuel's stomach tighten. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and left. The moment he walked through the door of Emily's office, he could tell something was wrong. She was pacing, a stack of papers in her hands, her face lined with frustration. He closed the door behind him. What happened? Emily threw the papers onto her desk. Holloway's lawyers just filed a countersuit. Samuel's expression darkened. On what grounds? She exhaled sharply. Defamation. They're claiming that by going to the press and exposing the HOA's practices, you've damaged Holloway's reputation and the reputation of Ridgecrest. Samuel scoffed. Damaged his reputation? He's a crook. He added my land to the HOA illegally, used it as a bargaining chip for his deals, and tried to force me out of my home. He's the one who should be worried about his reputation. Emily nodded, but her face remained tense. I agree, but this isn't just about making noise. It's a stall tactic. If he can drag this out in court long enough, he might be able to cover his tracks or pressure you into settling. Samuel leaned forward, his jaw tight. I'm not settling. She smirked. I didn't think you would. But we need to be careful. This isn't just about proving he's guilty anymore. Now we need to prove that you didn't knowingly spread false information. He narrowed his eyes. We have evidence. That should be enough. Emily tapped her fingers on the desk. You'd think so, But his legal team is going to argue that you misrepresented the situation, that you went public with the intention of ruining him. And they'll try to bury us in paperwork, stall proceedings, and make this as expensive as possible. Samuel exhaled through his nose. So, what do we do? Emily picked up one of the documents and held it up. We don't just defend. We go on the offensive. The fraud investigation is already underway. But if we can push for a full financial audit of the Ridgecrest HOA, we might uncover more than just property flipping. We might be able to prove embezzlement. Samuel's eyes sharpened. You think he was stealing from the HOA? Emily nodded. It's possible. The sudden rezoning, the way properties were seized and resold, the fact that some of those funds never seem to have been properly accounted for, it all points to something bigger. And if we can expose it, Holloway won't just lose the case, he'll lose everything. Samuel let that sink in. Holloway had thought he could strong-arm him into backing down, but now the fight had escalated beyond just one man's land. This was about everyone who had been wronged by Ridgecrest corruption. Samuel straightened his back. Then let's tear it all down. Emily grinned. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. She reached for her phone. I'll start making the necessary filings. The moment we push for an audit, this whole thing is going to explode. Samuel simply nodded. Let it. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice. And he wasn't going to stop until Holloway had nowhere left to run. Samuel Carter stood by the window of Emily's office, staring out at the city skyline while she made the calls to push for the financial audit. The sun had set, and the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows along the pavement. He had been in fights before, but this was different. This wasn't about fists or survival. It was about tearing down a corrupt system that had thrived on greed and manipulation for far too long. The sound of Emily hanging up her phone snapped him back to reality. It's done. The court approved the request for an independent audit. Holloway won't be able to stall this one. Samuel turned to face her. How soon does it start? Emily leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. The auditors are getting access first thing in the morning. Ridgecrest financial records are now officially under scrutiny. If there's anything illegal buried in those numbers, we'll find it. Samuel nodded. It was only a matter of time now. Holloway had been playing a long game, using legal loopholes and intimidation to keep his operation running. But the cracks were finally starting to show. The question was, how desperate would he get now that the walls were closing in? As if answering that thought, Emily's office phone rang again. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. Ridgecrest's legal team. Samuel crossed his arms. Put on speaker. Emily hit the button, and a cold, measured voice filled the room. Ms. Graves, we've just been informed that your client has initiated a financial audit against Ridgecrest Homeowners Association. This is an unnecessary escalation and a blatant attempt to harass our organization. Emily smirked. It's not harassment if it's legal. The voice on the other end remained composed. We're prepared to counter this action with a formal complaint of legal overreach and malicious intent. If this audit does not cease immediately, we will seek damages. Samuel's patience was wearing thin. He stepped closer to the desk. You tell Holloway that if he had nothing to hide, he wouldn't be afraid of an audit. There was a brief pause before the man responded. Mr. Carter, I advise you to tread carefully. You're up against more than just a homeowners association. Samuel narrowed his eyes. Is that a threat? Another pause. Just a warning. The line went dead. Emily let out a slow breath, shaking her head. They're scared. That's the only reason they call to try and intimidate you. Samuel wasn't intimidated. He had seen fear in men's eyes before, and he recognized it now. Holloway's empire was crumbling, and for the first time, he was losing control. Samuel wasn't about to let up. If they were scared now, they had every reason to be, because the truth was coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The next morning, Samuel Carter arrived at the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association office, just as the auditors did. 3 professionals in dark suits stepped out of a government-issued sedan, their expressions unreadable as they approached the glass doors of the building. Samuel stood back, watching as they entered, feeling the weight of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just about some legal technicality anymore. This was about exposing the foundation of corruption that had propped up Holloway's empire for years. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Employees moved stiffly, avoiding eye contact with the auditors as they set up in the main conference room. Stacks of financial records were rolled in, and computer systems were unlocked for review. Holloway was nowhere to be seen, but his presence was felt in the nervous energy that lingered in the air. Samuel leaned against the wall near the entrance, arms crossed, as he observed the unfolding scene. It didn't take long before the first red flag surfaced. One of the auditors raised an eyebrow as he scanned a document on his screen. He exchanged a glance with his colleague before calling one of the Ridgecrest accountants over. "This expense report. These numbers don't match the submitted filings from last quarter." The accountant hesitated. "There must be a clerical error. We'll provide updated figures." The auditor gave him a pointed look. "No need. We'll cross-check these ourselves." The accountant swallowed hard and backed away. Samuel smirked. Holloway's carefully crafted paper trail was beginning to unravel, and it was happening in real time. Just then, the front doors swung open. Holloway entered, his face a mask of barely contained frustration. His eyes immediately locked on Samuel. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Samuel didn't move, watching the show. Holloway's jaw clenched, but before he could continue, one of the auditors stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, we need you to answer some questions about these financial inconsistencies." Holloway forced a smile. "I'll have my legal team provide the necessary clarifications." The auditor shook his head. "That won't be necessary. We're pulling direct transaction histories. If there's nothing to hide, there shouldn't be an issue." Holloway's composure wavered. "I don't appreciate the implication." Samuel chuckled. "You don't have to. The facts speak for themselves." Holloway shot him a glare before turning back to the auditors. His voice was controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge of panic beneath it. "I need to speak with my attorney. We'll schedule an official response." The lead auditor remained unfazed. "You'll have that opportunity, but in the meantime, we'll continue our review." Holloway didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked swiftly toward his office, his movements tense and deliberate. Samuel exchanged a glance with Emily, who had just arrived. She arched an eyebrow. "He's cracking." Samuel nodded. "And it's only going to get worse." Over the next several hours, the auditors uncovered more discrepancies. Missing funds, questionable property sales, large transfers to untraceable accounts. Each discovery chipped away at Holloway's defenses until, finally, the auditors stepped back. One of them made a call. Minutes later, 2 county officials entered the building, followed closely by uniformed officers. Samuel straightened. "This was it." Holloway emerged from his office just as the lead county investigator approached him. "Nathan Holloway, you are under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and unlawful seizure of homeowner properties. You'll need to come with us." Holloway's face turned ashen. "You can't be serious. I'm the president of this association. This is a misunderstanding." The investigator remained firm. "You have the right to contest the charges in court. But for now, you'll be taken in for questioning." The room fell into stunned silence as the officers stepped forward. Holloway's breath quickened, his mind scrambling for a way out. But there was none. With no other option, he reluctantly placed his hands behind his back as the cuffs clicked into place. Samuel watched as they led him away. Holloway had built his empire on greed and deceit, but in the end, the truth had won. He took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. It was over. Ridgecrest's reign of corruption had come to an end. Emily stepped beside him, arms crossed. "Not bad for an old man." Samuel chuckled. "Not bad at all." Outside, news cameras flashed as Holloway was loaded into the back of a patrol car. The fight had been long, but justice had finally been served. And Samuel Carter had done what no one thought possible. He had taken down the most powerful man in Ridgecrest. Samuel Carter sat on his porch, the evening air cool against his skin as he gazed out at the land he had spent his life protecting. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind: investigations, legal battles, and a fight that had pushed him further than he thought he could go. But in the end, it had all been worth it. Ridgecrest Homeowners Association was collapsing. With Holloway arrested and facing multiple charges, The entire HOA board had been thrown into disarray. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak out were now coming forward, sharing their own experiences of intimidation and wrongful fines. The county had officially intervened, freezing Ridgecrest accounts and ordering a full audit of every transaction the HOA had made under Holloway's leadership. The scam was bigger than anyone had imagined. Over the years, Holloway had used Ridgecrest as his personal bank, funneling money from inflated fees, fabricated violations, and forced foreclosures straight into his own investments. But now it was over. The county had seized Ridgecrest records, multiple lawsuits were already being filed, and the HOA itself was on the brink of dissolution. The people of Ridgecrest were finally free. Samuel took a slow breath, the weight of it all finally settling in. He had won. His land was safe, his name cleared, and the corruption that had threatened to take everything from him had been exposed for all to see. But the victory wasn't just his. It belonged to every homeowner who had been wronged, to every person who had been too afraid to fight back. He had set a precedent. No HOA, no corrupt bureaucrat, no self-serving official could ever do this again without facing consequences. A car pulled up along his driveway, and he recognized it instantly. Emily stepped out, carrying a thick file of legal documents. She walked up the steps and handed them over with a smirk. Official confirmation. Your property is no longer under HOA jurisdiction. Samuel took the file, flipping through the pages, letting the words sink in. It was over, truly over. He looked up at Emily, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You did good, she said. Samuel chuckled. Not bad for an old man. Huh? She shook her head, amused. You're impossible. He watched as she leaned against the porch railing, her expression shifting to something more thoughtful. So, what now? Samuel exhaled, looking out over his land, the fields stretching out beneath the soft glow of the setting sun. For the first time in a long time, he had no battle to fight, no threats looming over his home. I think I'll just enjoy the quiet for a while. Emily nodded. You've earned that. The two sat in comfortable silence for a moment before she straightened. Well, if you ever feel like raising hell again, you know where to find me. Samuel smirked. I'll keep that in mind. As she drove away, he leaned back in his chair, the familiar creak of the old wood beneath him grounding him in the moment. He had spent his life fighting for what mattered. This fight had been no different. He had faced a system designed to break people like him, and he had beaten it. Not with money, not with power, but with sheer will and the truth on his side. The night air was still, the land around him peaceful. For the first time in years, Samuel Carter finally felt free.